There's this guy, he's 6'2", handsome, good build, racially ambiguous. He has everything going for him is what I'm saying. Nice smile, just an overall charming guy. He's a chef in this town and he loves it. If you ask him, he says he has never worked a day in his life. Good food brings good people, which brings good vibes, is his motto. In this town he lives in, there is a huge building on the outskirts of town. In that building, twice a year, a huge charity even is hosted by a celebrity that is a huge food connoisseur. They bring in chefs from all around the world to come and cook, showing off their talents in front of a variety of people. They usually grab a couple locals from the town and have them help out as well. Now, some people have made careers off of this, but even those who just work as waitstaff, dishwashers, cleaners, they are still paid a hefty sum. At the worst, it's going to be the best payday you had that year. This handsome 6'2", racially ambiguous man. I hate referring to him in that way, so let's give him the name Bill. No, that's too generic. Eric, Steve, Gary. Everybody loves Gary. Gary's dream is to one day be chosen to go and cook for the event. It'll most likely never happen because they fly in chefs from around the world that are at the top of their class. They all have multiple stars, and Gary is well just a chef in a middling city. Not a small city by any means, but just average. Though his restaurant is considered the best in his city, it is still average on the world scale. So he's stuck just feeling envious of his own waitstaff that has been chosen to go and work the event. It's sort of the unwritten rule of the city that anyone chosen is given a couple days off to prepare. All the waitstaff goes to the venue a couple days early to get the rundown, become familiar with the venue, and giving some training on a couple finer details. Gary considered not giving him the days off. Well, because fuck him. But he's much too nice for that, and he knows it will be good money and hopefully he'll bring back some good stories. So of course he tells him he can have the days off. It's a good day in the restaurant. Everyone from the patrons to the workers are in extremely high spirits, speaking about the event that's set to happen in a couple days. But for Gary, it has to be business as usual. Can't get stuck in conversation when there's a restaurant full of people needing to be fed. A usual day with unusual excitement, but the day ends the same. As the restaurant is closing and everyone is busy cleaning up, boxing up some leftovers to take home and enjoy, there's a knock at the door and a couple dapper men standing there. One of the workers opens the door to notify the gentleman that they had just closed and will reopen tomorrow at 11 a.m. He had an annoyed look on his face as he said it, likely because this isn't the first time people have shown up fashionably late. The men said they had already eaten in the restaurant earlier and wondered if they could have a word with the chef. Normally, they would just brush them off and tell them return tomorrow if they have any business, but the get-up made you think they weren't normal people. Perhaps there is business that Gary needed to attend to. So they call Gary from the back and he comes to the front and shakes their hand. The men introduce themselves as part of the group that organizes the charity event. They arrived a bit earlier than usual and decided to stop in for a meal as they heard this was one of the best restaurants in the city. The best restaurant in the city, Gary asserted, to which the men chuckled. True, and a great chef like you deserves to be so arrogant, one of the men said. Then what happened next left Gary in shock. They invited Gary to be one of the chefs to take part in the event. Gary assumed that all the chefs were chosen well beforehand. And they are, but not all chefs invited are cooks. Some are consultants, some just make the menu, and others are just invited to eat, though they give their input anyway. Needless to say, Gary wasn't happy. He was ecstatic, over the moon, any other happy phrase you want to put in. He felt all of it. The men gave Gary the menu of the restaurant and would stop in the next couple days before the event to sample Gary's items that he was in charge of from the menu. He was in charge of some of the appetizers and a couple garnishes that will be going out with the food. You would think that wouldn't mean much. But to them, it was everything. They believed in a complete meal. That must be great from start to finish. A bad appetizer sets up for a mediocre meal, regardless of how good the rest of it was. Gary passed with flying colors. His nervousness didn't take away from making an excellent meal. Then finally, the day came. To get to the venue is about an hour drive from the city. Gary's excitement made the hour feel like 10 minutes, which was still too long for him. He'd been waiting for this moment since he opened the restaurant, to finally be recognized for his culinary skills. He hoped to get a couple tips from some of the chefs that will be in attendance. As he went down the long pathway to the building, which looked like something out of a medieval book. Or Harry Potter. Let's go with Harry Potter. He finally arrived at the chef's entrance in the back. Turns out the venue is an old castle that's been refurbished for events such as this one. Gary was impressed with the ambience and the service that they provide. There were signs around stating if anything was left behind, to notify management, and they will have it brought to you. Do not come back. Gary thought that made sense considering the clientele that will be in attendance. Gary joined the army of chefs, maids, butlers, and waiters that was in the large kitchen. An extensive kitchen with many items that seem as if they have no use. Some things in there were tools Gary seen at butcher shops and cattle ranches. He pointed it out, and a chef approached him. He introduced himself as one of the consultants and told Gary he is often at these events. The tools are seldomly used, but at times some eccentric patrons like to bring entire cows and chickens fresh from the farm, but those are for separate events and will not be needed for today's event, so they are off to the side. Far from it to know how these billionaires think Gary thought, and off to prep and get things ready for the event. People started to fill in around 5 p.m., and there was some time to mingle, followed by a live performance and then a speech by the organizer. Then off to dinner. Gary looked up at the clock and saw it hit 9 p.m. The dinner was just finishing up. It went off without a hitch. A lot of chefs complimented Gary on his efficiency and quality of work, giving him business cards if he's ever in their country and want to learn more of their cuisine. Which was more than he could ask for. Gary was satisfied at just putting out decent apps. By the time they all finished cleaning, it was closer to 10 p.m. Exhausted, Gary got in his car and went off. As he arrived home, Gary realized he still had the key to the back door of the building. They were told to leave the keys, but if took home, don't worry too much, as the locks are changed regularly at the venue. Still, the venue's only an hour away, and maybe he won't get another chance to ever cook there again. He decided to go back with the excuse to drop off the key. He remembered the sign telling people to not come back and instead contact management. But that is for the guests, to not inconvenience them. As Gary came closer to the venue, he noticed something weird. The hour drive there and back, it is now midnight, and yet the lot is full of cars. Perhaps it's a cleaning crew giving the place a deep clean. As he noticed, the staff lot in the back was empty and only the front was filled. He went into the kitchen and was making his way to the main hall to take one more look when suddenly a light shined. He peeked and saw the room full of people, but something was weird. They were all wearing masks, including the maitre d' that hopped on a stage and began speaking. Welcome to the auction house. Perhaps this is part of the charity. They auction off items to raise more money. But why so late at night was the thought that crossed Gary's mind. The thought that would soon be overtook by the horror he saw next. Bring in the first item, and a man wheeled in a tiger, followed by a sea turtle, then pieces of blue whale, as he joked that it wouldn't fit in his van. All these animals were endangered species. Gary couldn't believe his eyes, but what was next was worse. So far the auction had been tamed, some bids here and there, but nothing too crazy. Then the crowd erupted as they brought out the next item. It was a human, but not just anyone. The waiter from Gary's shop that was invited, naked, tied up in a cage. Gary remembers someone telling him that his waiter was impressive and was poached by a chef to work in a larger city. Gary was sad to let him go, but knew of the great opportunity it was. So he congratulated him later while they were cleaning when the event was over. He remembers the shine in his eyes as he gloated about the big things he was going to do in a big market. He thanked Gary for everything, saying if it wasn't for Gary being such an outstanding chef, maybe he would never have gotten noticed had he worked in a lesser restaurant. Gary knew what was about to happen as he glanced at the equipment that looks like it's from a meat processing plant. He had to notify someone. Gary reached in his pocket to pull out his phone, but it slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor. Gary paused for a moment, scared to look, but he noticed no one turned to look. Luckily, the hall was making so much noise that no one noticed, but then Gary heard the turn of the lock. Someone was coming through the door. I have to hide, was Gary's last thought. As he opened his eyes, with a hell of a migraine, Gary realized he was sitting at the head of the hall on stage, tied to a chair. Then the maitre d' stood next to him. Gary screamed as loud as he could, but his mouth was bound. Shaking in his chair, tears in his eyes, desperation, praying for someone to come save him. Someone then came and gave him an ejection that mellowed him. He could hear and see everything that was happening, but could not react. The maitre d' continued, Well, such a surprise tonight. I thought we only had one two-legged animal. Who would have thought a second would have come crawling in? He has a height of 6 feet, a good build, and looks like a tasty meal. You may have missed out on the first, but I assure you this one will be just as tender. Steak bites, tacos, a bit of burger, I'm sure all will be possible and more to share. Shall we start at a couple million? 5, you can do better. 10, there we go, keep trucking along. 20, well, going once, going twice, sold for 20 million. Who would have thought a chef selling plates for $20 would be worth 20 million? Guess you can never guess someone's worth. That's all for this evening's auction. Enjoy the festivities as our butchers and chefs prepare your meal. And as always, thank you all for visiting the auction house.